She came to him in the dying light with blood on her hands and terror in her eyes, asking only for a shadow to hide in while death rode past his door. And he gave her more than shelter, he gave her a reason to believe the world hadn't forgotten. Mercy. The sky was bruising purple when Wikapi stumbled into the valley, her lungs burning with every breath she dragged into her chest. The earth beneath her feet was hard and unforgiving, scattered with stones that bit through the worn solace of her moccasins. Behind her, far enough to be a whisper, but close enough to feel like a noose tightening, came the sound of hooves pounding the dry ground. The outlaws were relentless, their laughter carried on the wind like the cries of hunting wolves. She had been running for 2 days, maybe 3. Time had blurred into a smear of fear and exhaustion. Her dark hair, once braided with care, now hung in tangled strands across her face, sticking to the sweat and dust that covered her skin. Her dress, a simple garment of buckskin and traded cloth, was torn at the hem and stained with the red dirt of the plains. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to put distance between herself and the men who had murdered her brother and would not stop until they silenced her too. It had happened 3 nights ago at the trading post near the fork of the Greybull River. Her brother, Dakota, had been there to trade furs, and she had accompanied him because their mother was ill and could not make the journey. The post was a rough place, full of trappers and drifters, men whose eyes lingered too long and whose voices carried the stink of whiskey. Dakota had warned her to stay close, to keep her head down. She had tried. But when the man with the scar across his cheek had grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back room, Dakota had intervened. The fight had been brief and brutal. Dakota had managed to land a solid blow before the scarred man's companions joined in. She had screamed, but no one came. When the dust settled, her brother lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, and the scarred man stood over him with a knife in his hand. She had run then, barefoot and wild, into the night. And they had followed. Not because she was a threat, but because she had seen their faces, knew their names, and could bring the law down on them if she ever reached a town that cared. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, Wikapi saw the outline of a structure in the distance. It was small and square, a rancher's cabin set against the backdrop of low hills. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin ribbon of gray against the deepening blue. She did not know who lived there, did not know if they would help or turn her away. But she had no choice. Her legs were trembling, her vision swimming with black spots. If she did not find shelter soon, she would collapse, and the outlaws would find her lying in the dirt like a wounded animal. She forced herself forward, each step a small victory against the weight of her exhaustion. The cabin grew larger, its details sharpening in the fading light. It was built of rough-hewn logs, the gaps between them chinked with mud and moss. A small corral stood to one side, empty save for a single horse that lifted its head to watch her approach. The windows glowed with the warm light of a fire, and she could see the shadow of a man moving inside. She reached the door and stopped, her hand hovering over the weathered wood. Her heart hammered in her chest, loud enough that she thought he might hear it from inside. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the darkening landscape for any sign of pursuit. The valley was quiet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. They were coming. They would not stop. She raised her fist and knocked, 3 soft taps that seemed to echo in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and she found herself staring up at a man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as the hills behind him. Slade Bennett was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a frame that spoke of years spent working the land. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of creases that came from squinting into the sun and enduring harsh winters. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples, and his eyes were a pale blue, sharp and assessing. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and canvas pants tucked into scuffed boots. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster worn smooth from use. He looked at her without speaking, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her bleeding feet, the wild desperation in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. For a moment, she could only stand there, trembling, her body swaying with the effort of remaining upright. Finally, she managed to force the words out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "May I hide here till the outlaws pass?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes flicked past her, scanning the valley as she had done, looking for the danger she had brought to his door. Then he stepped aside, his expression unreadable, and nodded once. She did not wait for him to change his mind. She slipped past him into the cabin, her legs nearly giving out as she crossed the threshold. The warmth hit her like a physical force, wrapping around her chilled body and making her knees buckle. She caught herself against the edge of a rough wooden table, her fingers gripping the scarred surface as she fought to stay upright. Behind her, the door closed with a solid thunk, and she heard the scrape of a heavy bar being dropped into place. The cabin was small, a single room that served as both living space and sleeping quarters. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A narrow bed stood in one corner, covered with a faded quilt. The table she leaned against was flanked by two mismatched chairs, and a shelf on the far wall held a few tin plates, a coffee pot, and a small collection of tools. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, a simple, honest scent that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She turned to look at the man who had let her in, and found him watching her with that same unreadable expression. He had not moved from the door, one hand resting on the bar as if he might need to lift it again at a moment's notice. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, too small to carry the weight of what he had done. He had opened his door to a stranger, a Lakota woman fleeing from danger, without asking questions or demanding explanations. In a world where her people were often met with suspicion or hostility, his silent acceptance was a gift she had not expected. He nodded again, a brief dip of his chin, and finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifting under a wagon wheel. "You hurt." It was not a question. She glanced down at herself, at the cuts on her arms, the blood seeping through the torn fabric of her dress, the raw, blistered skin of her feet. She had not allowed herself to think about the pain, had pushed it down beneath the more pressing need to survive. But now, standing in the warmth and safety of his cabin, the adrenaline that had kept her moving began to drain away, and the pain rushed in to fill the void. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He moved then, crossing the room with a deliberate, measured gait. He pulled out one of the chairs and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window, to the door, to the shadows in the corners. He seemed to understand. "They won't find you tonight." His voice was steady, certain. "Sit." She obeyed, sinking into the chair with a shuddering breath. Her body felt like it was made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. He disappeared into a corner of the cabin and returned with a basin of water, a rag, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set them on the table in front of her and knelt down, his movements careful and unhurried. He did not ask permission before reaching for her foot, lifting it gently to examine the damage. She flinched at the touch, not from pain but from the sheer unexpectedness of it. No man outside her family had ever touched her with such care. He dipped the rag into the water and began to clean the cuts, his hands steady and sure. The water was cool against her burning skin, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. He worked in silence, his focus absolute, as if this small act of kindness was the only thing that mattered in the world. When he finished with her feet, he moved to her hands, wiping away the blood and dirt, then gently pressing a salve into the deeper cuts. The salve smelled of pine and something bitter, and it stung at first before settling into a dull numbness. She watched him as he worked, the stranger who had asked for nothing and given everything. His face was lined with the kind of sorrow that came from loss, the kind that settled into the bones and never quite left. She wondered what he had lost, what had brought him to this lonely place, but she did not ask. Some wounds were too deep to speak of. When he was finished, he stood and moved to the fire, pouring coffee from the pot that sat warming on the hearth. He handed her a tin cup, and she wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her palms. The coffee was strong and bitter, and it burned her tongue, but she drank it anyway, grateful for the small comfort it provided. He poured a cup for himself and leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the window. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words were not always necessary, that sometimes the simple act of presence was enough. She studied him over the rim of her cup, noting the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from the gun at his hip. He was a man who had learned to be vigilant, to trust nothing and no one. And yet, he had let her in. Outside the night deepened, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the gaps in the walls. She shivered, and he noticed. He crossed to the bed and pulled the quilt from it, draping it over her shoulders without a word. The fabric was worn soft with age, and it smelled faintly of sage. She pulled it tight around herself, feeling the weight of it like an embrace. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. He nodded, returning to his place by the window. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "What's your name?" "Wickapi." He repeated it, the syllables unfamiliar on his tongue, but he said it with respect. "Slade." She nodded, committing the name to memory. It suited him, hard and unyielding like the edge of a knife. They lapsed into silence again, but this time it felt different. Less like the quiet of strangers, and more like the quiet of two people beginning to understand each other. The fire burned low, and the shadows grew longer. She felt her eyelids growing heavy, the exhaustion finally catching up with her. But she fought against it, afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake to find the outlaws at the door, or worse, that this moment of safety was nothing more than a dream. Slade must have sensed her struggle, because he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "Sleep. I'll keep watch." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but found none. There was only a quiet determination, a promise unspoken, but understood. She wanted to argue, to insist that she could not burden him further, but the words would not come. Instead, she nodded and let herself lean back in the chair, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes drifted closed, and for the first time in days, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She did not sleep deeply, her rest broken by flashes of memory. Dakota's face, the scarred man's laughter, the sound of hooves in the dark. But each time she woke, gasping and disoriented, she found Slade still standing by the window, his silhouette solid and reassuring against the faint glow of the fire. And each time, she let herself slip back under, trusting in his silent vigil. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the shifting of the fire and the occasional gust of wind against the cabin walls. At some point, she woke to find Slade adding wood to the fire, the flames leaping up to cast his face in sharp relief. He glanced at her, and their eyes met for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, a question perhaps, or maybe just recognition. Two people who had been broken by the world, finding themselves in the same small space, bound together by circumstance and something deeper, something neither of them could yet name. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, Wickapi stirred, her body stiff and aching. She opened her eyes to find Slade still at the window, his face drawn with fatigue. He had not slept, she realized. He had kept his word, standing guard through the long night to keep her safe. She sat up slowly, the quilt slipping from her shoulders, and he turned at the sound. His eyes were bloodshot, but his expression was calm. "They didn't come," he said simply. She nodded, relief washing over her like a wave. But even as she felt the tension ease, she knew it was only temporary. The outlaws were still out there, still hunting. And sooner or later, they would find her. Slade moved away from the window and poured fresh coffee into both their cups, the steam rising in thin wisps that caught the early morning light. He set her cup on the table before her and returned to his position, but this time he pulled the other chair closer and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the night had finally settled into his bones. She watched him, noting the deep lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly. He had given her his rest, his peace, and asked for nothing in return. The silence between them stretched, but it was different now in the pale dawn light. It felt less like the quiet of strangers and more like the pause before a confession. Before words that needed to be spoken finally found their way out. "Why did you let me in?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. He could have turned her away, could have kept his door barred and his life simple. Instead, he had opened it to danger, to trouble that was not his own. He stared into his coffee for a long moment, as if searching for the answer in the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been regret or memory. "I turned someone away once. Long time ago. Winter storm, worse than anything I'd seen. Man came to my door, bleeding, half frozen. Said men were after him. I didn't ask why. I just told him I couldn't get involved." He paused, his jaw tightening. Found him the next morning about a mile down the road. Frozen solid. The men who'd been chasing him had caught up, finished what they started. He looked up at her then, and she saw the weight of that decision in his eyes, the guilt that had carved itself into him like words on a tombstone. "I swore I'd never do that again." She felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the fear that had held her so tightly. He was not just a stranger offering shelter. He was a man trying to redeem himself, to make right a wrong that still haunted him. She understood that kind of burden, the weight of things left undone, words left unspoken. She thought of Dakota, of the moment she had run instead of staying, of the guilt that gnawed at her in the dark hours. "I should have fought with him," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "My brother. I should have stayed." Slade shook his head slowly. "You'd be dead too. Running was the smart choice." "But it doesn't feel smart," she said, her throat tight. "It feels like cowardice." He leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Staying alive when everything in you wants to give up, that's not cowardice. That's the hardest kind of courage there is." The words settled between them like a benediction, a shared understanding that both of them were carrying weights they could not put down. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her, and for the first time since Dakota's death, she felt something other than grief and fear. She felt seen. Slade stood and moved to the window again, peering out at the valley below. The sun was rising now, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber. It was beautiful, achingly so, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could wake to this view every morning, where safety was not a fleeting thing but a constant. But reality intruded quickly. She could not stay here. The outlaws would not give up, and every moment she remained put Slade in greater danger. As if reading her thoughts, Slade spoke without turning from the window. "You planning to run again?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I have to. If they find me here, they'll kill you too." He turned then, his expression hard. "Let them try." The certainty in his voice startled her. This was not bravado or foolishness. This was a man who had made a decision and would stand by it, no matter the cost. But she could not let him do that. She could not let another person die because of her. "I won't let you throw your life away for me," she said firmly. He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, bringing himself level with her eyes. "Listen to me. I've been alone in this valley for 5 years. 5 years of nothing but wind and silence. I thought that's what I wanted, thought I deserved it after what I'd done. But you showing up at my door last night, that was the first time in a long time I felt like maybe I still had something to offer this world. I'm not throwing my life away. I'm finally using it for something that matters." His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She saw the truth of it in his eyes, the desperation of a man who had been drowning in his own guilt and had finally found something to hold on to. She reached out without thinking, her hand covering his where it rested on the arm of the chair. His skin was warm and rough, scarred from years of hard work. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned his hand over, his fingers curling gently around hers. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a bridge built between two isolated souls. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Wikapi's head snapped toward the window, her body going rigid. Slade was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years anticipating danger. He peered out, his expression darkening. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror rising in her throat. He was silent for a moment, counting. 4, maybe 5. She stood, her mind racing. She could run, slip out the back and disappear into the hills. But they would see her, and Slade would be left to face their questions, their anger. Or she could stay and let him stand between her and the men who wanted her dead. Neither option felt like a choice. Both felt like a trap. Slade turned from the window, his face set with grim determination. He moved to the wall and took down his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Then he looked at her, and his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Get under the bed. Stay there no matter what you hear. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she would not cower while he faced danger alone. But she saw the look in his eyes, the unyielding resolve, and she knew that arguing would only waste precious time. She nodded and moved quickly to the bed, dropping to her knees and sliding beneath it. The space was narrow and dark, smelling of dust and old wood. She pressed herself flat against the floor, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. Above her, she heard Slade's footsteps moving across the cabin, the scrape of the bar being lifted from the door. Then the door opened, and she heard his voice, steady and cold. "Morning, gentlemen. Can I help you?" A rough voice answered, thick with menace. "We're looking for a girl. Lakota. She came through here last night." Slade's response was measured, revealing nothing. "Haven't seen anyone. Then here alone." The voice grew harder, more insistent. "You sure about that? Because we tracked her to this valley, and your cabin's the only shelter for miles." Slade did not waver, "I'm sure. Now if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." There was a pause, heavy and dangerous. Then another voice spoke, this one colder, more controlled. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Just to be sure, Wikapi held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed. She could hear the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of spurs as men dismounted. This was it. The moment that would determine whether she lived or died. And Slade, this man she had known for less than a day, was the only thing standing between her and the violence that waited just beyond the door Slade's hand rested on. The doorframe, his body blocking the entrance like a wall of stone, and the air between him and the mounted outlaws crackled with the kind of tension that precedes gunfire. The leader, a man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with deliberate weight. He was tall and lean, dressed in a long duster coat stained with travel and violence. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, cold and calculating. Behind him, 3 other men remained on horseback, their hands resting on their gun belts, fingers twitching with anticipation. The scarred man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that promised pain. "We've been tracking that girl for 3 days now. She killed a man back at the Greybull trading post. Murdered him in cold blood. We aimed to bring her to justice. Slade's expression did not change, his voice flat and hard as iron. That's so. The scarred man took a step closer, his eyes scanning Slade's face for any sign of weakness. That's so. And the law pays good money for information leading to the capture of murderers. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Have you seen a Lakota woman come through here? Slade met his gaze without flinching. And I'm going to tell you one more time. No. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. The scarred man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. He glanced past Slade into the dim interior of the cabin, his eyes narrowing. You won't mind if we take a look then? Just to satisfy our curiosity. Slade shifted his weight slightly, his hand moving closer to the rifle, leaning against the doorframe. I mind. This is my property, and you're not welcome on it. One of the men on horseback laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. He was younger than the others, with a patchy beard and wild eyes that spoke of too much whiskey and too little sense. Listen to him, acting like he's got a choice. There's 4 of us and 1 of him. The scarred man held up a hand, silencing the younger man without looking at him. His eyes remained fixed on Slade. Now, friend, there's no need for this to get ugly. We're just doing our job. You help us out, we ride away, and everyone stays breathing. You don't help us, well, things get complicated. Slade's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. You're not law. You're bounty hunters, and from the look of you, not the kind that brings people in alive. So let me make this simple. You're trespassing. You've got 5 seconds to get back on your horses and ride out of here. The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, and in that instant, time seemed to slow. Slade's hand shot out, grabbing the rifle and bringing it up in one smooth motion. The barrel was pointed at the scarred man's chest before anyone else could move. The other 3 men reached for their weapons, but froze when they saw Slade's finger on the trigger. The scarred man raised his hand slowly, that cold smile returning to his face. Easy now. No need for anyone to die over this. Slade's voice was low and deadly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Now mount up and ride. The scarred man studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. Then he nodded slowly and took a step back. All right, we'll go. But this isn't over. We know she came through here, and we're not going anywhere until we find her. He turned and walked back to his horse, swinging up into the saddle with easy grace. The other men followed suit, their eyes never leaving Slade. The scarred man gathered his reins and looked down at Slade one last time. You're making a mistake, friend. When we find her, and we will, you're going to wish you'd helped us. Slade did not respond, just kept the rifle trained on them until they turned their horses and rode back down the trail. He watched them until they disappeared over the ridge, then lowered the rifle and stepped back inside, closing the door and dropping the bar into place. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding. He had faced down men before, had stared death in the eye more times than he cared to remember. But this felt different. This time, he was not just protecting himself. He was protecting her. Wikipe crawled out from under the bed, her face pale but her eyes fierce. They're not going to leave. He shook his head. No, they'll camp somewhere close and wait. They think you're still here, and they're right. She stood, brushing the dust from her dress, her mind racing. Then I need to leave now, before they come back. Slade turned to her, his expression hard. Where will you go? They're between you and any town that might help. You run now, they'll catch you before sunset. She felt the frustration rising in her chest, hot and sharp. Then what do you suggest? That I stay here and wait for them to come back with more men. He crossed to the window and looked out, his jaw working. We need to buy time, make them think you've already moved on. She frowned, how he turned back to her, his eyes thoughtful. There's an old mining camp about 10 miles north of here. Abandoned years ago, but the trails are still clear. If we can make it look like you headed that direction, they might follow the false trail long enough for us to figure out a real plan." She considered this, her mind turning over the possibilities. "And if they don't fall for it, then we fight."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. She stared at him, this man who had already risked so much for a stranger. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." He met her gaze, and for a moment she saw past the hard exterior to the man beneath, the one who carried his own ghosts. "Maybe I don't. But that doesn't change what's right." They worked quickly, gathering supplies and preparing for what needed to be done. Slade pulled out an old pair of boots, smaller than his own, and handed them to her. "They belonged to my wife. She passed 5 years ago." Wickapi took them carefully, feeling the weight of what he was offering. Not just protection, but pieces of a life he had lost. She sat down and pulled them on, lacing them tight. "They fit well enough, thank you." He nodded and moved to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a worn canvas coat and a hat. "You'll need to look different, less recognizable." She put on the coat, the fabric rough against her skin, and tucked her hair up under the hat. When she looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, she barely recognized the person staring back. Slade studied her critically, then nodded. "Good, now we make the trail." They left the cabin together, moving quickly toward the tree line, to the north. Slade had brought a blanket and some tools, and he used them to create signs of passage: broken branches, disturbed earth, a piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush. He worked with the precision of a man who understood tracking, who knew what signs would be convincing and what would raise suspicion. Wickapi watched him, marveling at the care he took. When they reached a clearing about a mile from the cabin, he stopped and turned to her. "This is far enough. They'll find this trail and follow it for a while. By the time they realize it's false, we'll have had time to prepare." She looked back toward the cabin, hidden now behind the trees. "And then what?" He met her eyes, his expression serious. "Then we decide whether to run or stand." They made their way back to the cabin, moving carefully to avoid leaving an obvious trail. When they reached the door, Slade paused, his hand on the latch. "Inside, we need to talk about what comes next." She nodded, her stomach tight with anticipation. They entered, and he closed the door behind them, the bar falling into place with a solid thunk. The cabin felt different now, no longer a place of temporary refuge, but a fortress under siege. Slade moved to the table and spread out a rough map he had drawn, marking the locations of the cabin, the false trail, and the surrounding terrain. If they follow the trail north, they'll be gone for at least a few hours. "That gives us time." "Time for what?" she asked. He looked up at her, his eyes steady. "Time to decide if you're going to keep running, or if you're going to stand and fight." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Wickapi felt something shift inside her, a hardening of resolve she had not known she possessed. "I've been running for 3 days. I'm tired of it. But I won't let you die for me." Slade's expression softened slightly. "I'm not planning on dying. But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. These men are dangerous, but they're also predictable. They think they're hunting prey, not walking into a trap." She felt a flicker of hope, small but growing. "You have a plan." He nodded slowly. "The beginning of one. But it's going to require you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" She thought about the man standing before her, the stranger who had opened his door in the darkness, who had stood between her and violence without hesitation. She thought about the way he had tended her wounds with gentle hands, the way he had kept watch through the long night. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could trust him. "Yes," Slade outlined his plan, his voice low and steady. The cabin sat at the mouth of a narrow valley, with steep hills rising on either side. There was only one clear approach, the trail that led from the south. If the outlaws came back, they would have to come that way. And if we control that approach, Slade said, we control the fight. He pointed to the map, indicating spots on the hillsides. I can position myself here, with a clear line of sight down the trail. If they come, I'll have the high ground. And what about me? Wikapi asked. He looked at her, his expression serious. You stay in the cabin. If things go wrong, if I go down, you run. There's a back way out, through the canyon to the west. It's rough terrain, but you can make it on foot. Promise me you'll run if it comes to that. She wanted to argue, to insist that she would not abandon him. But she saw the determination in his eyes and knew that this was not a point he would concede. I promise. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Slade gathered ammunition and checked his weapons, moving with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Wikapi helped where she could, filling canteens with water, packing food into saddlebags in case they needed to move quickly. They worked in silence, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them both. As the sun climbed higher, Slade went outside to scout the hillsides, looking for the best position. Wikapi watched him from the window, his figure moving among the rocks and scrub pine with the sure-footedness of a man who knew this land intimately. When he returned, his face was set with grim satisfaction. I found a good spot. Rocky outcrop with cover and a clear view. If they come, I'll see them long before they see me. The afternoon stretched on, tense and quiet. They ate a simple meal of bread and dried meat, neither of them speaking much. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged with anticipation. Wikapi found herself watching Slade, noting the way he moved, the calm competence that radiated from him. He was not a young man, but he was strong, his body hardened by years of labor and survival. And there was something else, a quality she could not quite name. A steadiness, a reliability that made her feel safe even in the midst of danger. She wondered about the wife he had mentioned, the woman whose boots she now wore. What had she been like? Had she loved this quiet, solitary man? Had she found peace in this valley before death took her away? As if sensing her thoughts, Slade looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. Her name was Catherine. My wife. Wikapi met his eyes, surprised by this sudden confession. He had not spoken of his past beyond that brief mention earlier. She was a good woman, strong. She loved this place, loved the quiet. We came out here to start over, to leave behind the ugliness of the world. He paused, his hand stilling on the rifle. We had 3 good years before the fever took her. I buried her on the hill behind the cabin, where she could see the sunrise. Wikapi felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry. He nodded, his expression distant. I am too. After she died, I thought about leaving, going back east or maybe farther west. But I couldn't. This place, it's all I have left of her. So I stayed, and I've been alone ever since. She understood then, the depth of his loneliness, the way it had carved itself into him. He was a man haunted by loss, by the ghost of a love that had been taken too soon. And she realized that by helping her, he was not just trying to redeem himself for a past mistake. He was trying to feel connected again, to be part of something that mattered. I'm glad you stayed, she said softly. He looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain and shared hope. Me too. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills when Slade stood and moved to the window. He stood there for a long moment, scanning the valley below. Then he stiffened, his body going taut. They're coming. Wikapi was on her feet in an instant, her heart leaping into her throat. She moved to the window and looked out. In the distance, she could see them, 4 riders moving up the trail toward the cabin. They were still far away, but they were coming steadily, purposefully. Slade turned to her, his face calm but his eyes intense. "It's time. Remember what I told you. Stay inside, stay low, and if things go wrong, run." She nodded, her mouth dry. "Be careful." He reached out and touched her shoulder, a brief, reassuring gesture. "I will." Then he was gone, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the rocks. Wickapi stood alone in the cabin, her hands trembling. She moved away from the window and sat down in the chair by the fire, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of hoofbeats growing closer. She closed her eyes and thought of Dakota, of his smile and his strength. She thought of her mother, waiting in their village, not knowing what had become of her children. And she thought of Slade, this man who had become her protector, her ally, perhaps even something more. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. If it came to fighting, she would be ready. She stood and moved to the shelf where Slade kept his supplies. There, tucked behind a tin of coffee, was a small revolver. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hand. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew the basics. Point and pull the trigger. It was not complicated. She checked the cylinder, saw that it was loaded, and tucked it into the waistband of her skirt. The hoofbeats were very close now. She moved back to the window and peered out carefully, staying to the side so she would not be seen. The 4 riders had reached the clearing in front of the cabin. The scarred man was in the lead, his face hard and suspicious. They dismounted, and he gestured for the others to spread out. 2 of them moved toward the sides of the cabin, while the scarred man and the younger one approached the front door. Wickapi's heart pounded as she watched them. Where was Slade? She scanned the hillside but could not see him. Then she heard it, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. One of the men to the side of the cabin jerked and fell, clutching his leg. The scarred man spun toward the hillside, his gun coming up. The fight had begun. Chaos erupted in the clearing. The outlaws scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and their horses. Another shot rang out, and the younger man yelped as his hat flew off his head. The scarred man was shouting orders, his voice barely audible over the ringing echoes of gunfire. Wickapi pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear the bullets striking the cabin walls, the thud of lead hitting wood. One shot shattered the window, sending glass spraying across the floor. She dropped to her knees, covering her head with her arms. This was not the plan. Slade was supposed to drive them off, to make them retreat. But they were not retreating. They were fighting back, and they were angry. She heard the back door splinter, the sound of wood cracking under a heavy boot. Someone was coming in. She spun around, the revolver in her hand, and saw a figure stepping through the broken doorway. It was one of the outlaws, a thick-set man with a scarred face and wild eyes. He saw her and grinned, raising his gun. Time to end this, girl. Wickapi did not think. She raised the revolver and pulled the trigger. The gun roared in her hand, the recoil nearly knocking her backwards. The man staggered, his eyes going wide with shock. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his chest, then back up at her. Then he fell, crashing to the floor like a felled tree. She stood frozen, the gun still pointed at the place where he had been, her ears ringing from the shot. She had killed a man. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her stomach turn. But there was no time to process it, no time to feel anything but the raw need to survive. She heard more shots outside, heard Slade's rifle barking from the hillside. She moved to the broken window and looked out. The scarred man and one other were still standing, pinned down behind a water trough. The man Slade had shot in the leg was crawling toward his horse, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. As she watched, Slade fired again, and the man by the trough went down. The scarred man looked around wildly, realizing he was alone. Then he looked up toward the hillside, and his face twisted with rage and frustration. He raised his gun and fired several shots toward where Slade was hidden, then turned and ran for his horse. Wickapi watched as he mounted and kicked the animal into a gallop, racing away down the trail. Slade fired one more shot, but the scarred man was already out of range, disappearing into the trees. The valley fell silent, except for the moaning of the wounded man in the dirt. Wickapi stood at the window, her legs shaking, her hand still gripping the revolver. It was over. They had survived. She heard footsteps outside, and then Slade appeared, moving quickly toward the cabin. His face was grim, his rifle still in his hands. He saw the broken back door, and his expression darkened. He stepped inside and froze when he saw the body on the floor. His eyes moved to her, to the gun in her hand, and understanding dawned. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though she was not sure it was true. "I had to." He crossed to her and gently took the revolver from her hand, setting it on the table. "I know, you did good." She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding back. "I killed him." Slade pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him, her body shaking with the release of fear and adrenaline. He held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair, his voice low and soothing. "You're alive. That's what matters. You're alive." They stood there for a long moment, two people who had faced death together and come through the other side. Outside, the sun continued its descent, painting the valley in shades of gold and red. The battle was over, but Wickapi knew the war was not. The scarred man had escaped, and he would not forget. He would come back, and next time he would bring more men. But for now, in the safety of Slade's arms, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the warmth of being alive. The dead man's blood had seeped into the floorboards by the time they dragged him outside, and Wickapi knew that stain would remain long after his body was buried. A permanent reminder that violence had found its way into this quiet place. Slade worked without speaking, his movements efficient and practiced as he hauled the corpse toward a clearing beyond the corral. She helped him dig, the shovel biting into the hard earth with each thrust, her muscles burning with the effort. The wounded outlaw had crawled far enough down the trail to die alone, his body sprawled face down in the dirt where the buzzards would find him come morning. They left him there, a warning to anyone else who might come looking. Night fell heavy and complete, the kind of darkness that swallowed the world whole. Inside the cabin, Slade boarded up the shattered window and repaired the broken back door as best he could with the materials he had on hand. Wickapi cleaned the blood from the floor, scrubbing until her hands were raw and the water in the basin ran pink. But no amount of scrubbing could erase what had happened, could undo the fact that she had taken a life. Her hands had stopped shaking, but something else had settled into her bones. A cold understanding that the girl she had been 3 days ago no longer existed. That girl had died with Dakota at the trading post. The woman who remained was someone harder. Someone capable of pulling a trigger without hesitation. Slade lit a lantern and set it on the table, the flame casting long shadows that danced across the walls. He poured 2 cups of whiskey from a bottle he kept on the high shelf, the amber liquid catching the light like captured fire. He handed one to Wickapi, and she took it, the glass cold, against her palm. "Drink," he said quietly. "It helps." She raised the cup to her lips and swallowed, the whiskey burning a path down her throat and into her chest. She coughed, her eyes watering, but the warmth that spread through her was welcome. Slade drank his own in one long pull, then set the cup down and stared at it as if it held answers he could not find anywhere else. "How many men have you killed?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed and distant. "Too many. During the war, I stopped counting after the first year. After that, they just became faces in the smoke, uniforms and weapons, and nothing more." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But the ones that stay with you, the ones you remember, those are the ones you killed up close." The ones whose eyes you looked into. She understood what he meant. The outlaw's face was already burned into her memory, the surprise and pain in his expression as the bullet struck him. That image would not fade with time. It would only settle deeper, becoming part of the landscape of her thoughts. "Does it get easier?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, but you learn to carry it. You learn to live with what you've done and keep moving forward. That's all any of us can do." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day pressing down on them both. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the gaps in the walls. Wickapi thought about the scarred man, the leader who had escaped. He was out there somewhere in the darkness, nursing his wounds and plotting his revenge. She knew he would not give up, knew that men like him never did. They would keep coming until they got what they wanted, or until they were dead. And Slade, this man who had given her shelter and protection, would be their target now as much as she was. "I've brought this on you," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "You should have turned me away." Slade looked at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet determination. "I made my choice. I'd make it again." She felt something crack inside her chest, a wall she had built to protect herself from feeling too much. This man, this stranger who had become something more in the span of a single day and night, had chosen to stand with her against impossible odds. He had risked his life, his home, his peace, all for someone he barely knew. And she realized with startling clarity that she would do the same for him. That somewhere in the chaos and violence, a bond had formed between them, forged in blood and fear and trust. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. He nodded, and she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "You're welcome." The night stretched on, and neither of them slept. Slade kept watch at the window, his rifle across his knees, while Wickapi sat by the fire and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She thought about her mother, about the village she had left behind. By now, they would know that Dakota was dead. They would be mourning him, preparing his body for the journey to the spirit world. And they would wonder about her, whether she was alive or dead, whether she would ever come home. But she could not go back, not now. The outlaws knew her face, knew she was a witness to their crime. If she returned to her village, she would only bring danger to her people. She was alone now, cut off from everything she had known, adrift in a world that had proven itself cruel and unforgiving. But she was not entirely alone. She glanced at Slade, his profile etched in the dim light of the fire. He was a solitary man, a man who had chosen isolation over connection after losing the woman he loved. Yet he had opened his door to her, had fought for her, had shown her kindness when the world had shown her only violence. She wondered what would happen when this was over, when the outlaws were dealt with, and the immediate danger had passed. Would he send her away, eager to return to his quiet life? Or would he ask her to stay? And if he did, what would she say? The question hung in her mind, unanswered and unanswerable. The future was a dark country she could not see into, a place where anything might happen. For now, all she could do was survive the present, one moment at a time. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, Slade finally stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "We need supplies," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Food, ammunition, medicine. And we need information. The scarred man won't come back alone. He'll gather more men, probably out of Broken Creek or Cedar Falls. If we're going to survive this, we need to know what we're up against." Wickapi stood as well, her body stiff from sitting too long. "What do you suggest?" Slade moved to the table and unfolded the rough map he had drawn earlier. "There's a settlement about 15 miles east of here. Small place, just a trading post and a few buildings. Run by a man named Hoskins. We're not friends, but we're not enemies either. He might be willing to sell us what we need and tell us what he's heard." She studied the map, tracing the route with her finger. And if the outlaws are watching the trails? Slade's expression was grim. Then we'll have to be careful. We'll leave at first light, take the canyon route to the west. It's rough going, but it'll keep us off the main trails. With luck, we'll be there and back before anyone knows we've gone. She nodded, understanding the risk but also the necessity. They could not stay holed up in the cabin forever. Eventually, their supplies would run out, and they would be forced to move. Better to act now, while they still had the element of surprise. They gathered what they needed for the journey, filling saddlebags with water and the last of their food. Slade saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. The animal had been his companion for years, and it stood patiently as he tightened the cinch and checked the bridle. Wickapi had no horse of her own, so she would ride double with Slade, sitting behind him with her arms around his waist. The intimacy of the arrangement was not lost on her, but she pushed the thought aside. Survival came first. Everything else was secondary. They set out as the sun broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The canyon route was as rough as Slade had promised, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that twisted and turned like a serpent. The going was slow, the horse picking its way carefully over loose stones and fallen logs. Wickapi held on tightly, feeling the strength of Slade's body beneath her hands, the steady rhythm of his breathing. They did not speak. Both of them focused on the trail ahead and the potential dangers that might lurk around every bend. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and the air growing warm. By midday, they emerged from the canyon onto a wide plateau covered in sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. In the distance, Wickapi could see a thin column of smoke rising into the sky, marking the location of the settlement. They approached cautiously, Slade's hand never far from his gun. The settlement was even smaller than he had described, just a single building that served as both trading post and saloon, with a few ramshackle sheds and a corral out back. A handful of horses stood tied to the hitching rail, and Wickapi could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. Slade dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady on her waist. "Stay close," he said quietly, "and keep your head down. If anyone asks, you're my wife." She nodded, understanding the need for deception. A Lakota woman traveling with a white rancher would draw questions and attention, neither of which they could afford. They entered the trading post together, the door creaking on rusty hinges. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and unwashed bodies. A handful of men sat at a rough plank bar, their conversation dying as Slade and Wickapi stepped inside. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a graying beard and suspicious eyes, looked up from the glass he was wiping. "Slade, been a while." Slade nodded, his expression neutral. "Hoskins, I need supplies." The bartender's eyes flicked to Wickapi, lingering for a moment before returning to Slade. "That your woman?" Slade's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "She is." Hoskins grunted, apparently satisfied with the answer. "What do you need?" Slade rattled off a list: ammunition, flour, coffee, salt, medical supplies. Hoskins nodded and disappeared into a back room, leaving them alone with the other patrons. Wickapi kept her eyes down, her hands folded in front of her, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. But she could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity and suspicion. One of the men, a lean fellow with a pockmarked face and cruel eyes, spoke up. "Heard there was trouble over by Bennett's place. Some Indian girl killed a man, and a posse's out looking for her." Slade did not react, his voice calm and disinterested. "That's so." The pockmarked man leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Slade. "That's so. Word is she's traveling with someone. Someone who's helping her hide." Slade met his eyes, and there was steel in his voice. "Sounds like a lot of talk. You believe everything you hear." The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken threat. The pockmarked man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth. Just passing along what I heard. No offense meant. Slade held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned away as Hoskins returned with the supplies. The bartender set them on the counter and named a price. Slade paid without haggling, eager to be gone from this place. As they turned to leave, the pockmarked man spoke again, his voice casual but pointed. "You be careful out there, Bennett. Dangerous country these days. Never know who you might run into." Slade paused at the door, his hand on the latch.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"I can take care of myself." Then they were outside, the bright sunlight a relief after the oppressive dimness of the trading post. They loaded the supplies onto the horse and mounted quickly. Wickapi's arms wrapping around Slade's waist as he kicked the animal into a trot. They did not speak until they were well clear of the settlement, the buildings disappearing behind them. "That man knew," Wickapi said quietly. Slade nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, and if he knows, others will too. Word travels fast out here." She felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "What do we do?" Slade was silent for a moment, his mind working through the options. "We go back to the cabin, and we prepare. They're coming, probably sooner than we thought. We need to be ready." She nodded against his back, drawing strength from his certainty. They would face whatever came together. There was no other choice. The ride back was faster, Slade pushing the horse harder now that they had been seen. They reached the canyon as the sun was beginning its descent, the shadows lengthening across the rocky landscape. As they entered the narrow passage, Wickapi felt the familiar sense of enclosure, the towering walls blocking out the sky. It was like riding through the throat of some great stone beast, dark and suffocating. She tightened her grip on Slade, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of his body. They were halfway through the canyon when Slade suddenly reined in the horse, his body going tense. "What is it?" Wickapi whispered. He did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning the rocks above them. Then she heard it too, the faint sound of falling pebbles, the scrape of a boot on stone. They were not alone, a voice called out from above, echoing off the canyon walls. "Hold it right there, Bennett." Slade's hand moved toward his rifle, but another voice stopped him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. We've got guns trained on you from 3 different positions. You make a move and you're both dead." Slade's hand froze, his body rigid with tension. Wickapi felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was it. They had been caught. The scarred man appeared on a ledge above them, his face twisted with satisfaction. "Told you it wasn't over, Bennett. Now you're going to dismount nice and slow, and you're going to hand over that girl. Do it, and maybe I'll let you live." Slade did not move, his voice cold and steady. "And if I don't?" The scarred man's smile widened. "Then you die right here, and I take her anyway." Wickapi felt Slade's body shift slightly, his muscles coiling like a spring about to release. She knew what he was thinking, knew he was calculating the odds, looking for a way out. But there was no way out. They were trapped, outnumbered and outgunned. She leaned forward, her lips close to his ear. "Do what he says." Slade shook his head almost imperceptibly. "No." She felt a surge of desperation. "Please, I won't let you die for me." His voice was barely a whisper, so low that only she could hear. "Trust me." Then, louder, he called up to the scarred man. "All right, you win. I'm dismounting." He swung his leg over the horse's neck and slid to the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. Wickapi followed, her legs unsteady beneath her. Slade raised his hands, showing that he was unarmed. The scarred man gestured, and 2 other men appeared from behind the rocks, their guns drawn and pointed at Slade and Wickapi. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, moved forward and grabbed Wickapi roughly by the arm, yanking her away from Slade. She stumbled, crying out as the man's fingers dug into her flesh. Slade took a step forward, his face dark with fury, but the scarred man's gun swung toward him. "Don't even think about it." The bearded man dragged Wikapi toward the base of the cliff, where the scarred man was descending from his perch. She struggled, twisting against his grip, but he was too strong. When they reached the scarred man, he grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, girl. Killed 2 of my men. Cost me time and money." He leaned in close, his breath hot and foul against her face. "But that ends now. You're going to hang for what you did, and I'm going to collect the bounty." She spat in his face, and his expression twisted with rage. He backhanded her across the mouth, the force of the blow snapping her head to the side. She tasted blood, felt her lips split open. Slade roared and lunged forward, but one of the other outlaws clubbed him with the butt of a rifle, dropping him to his knees. Blood poured from a gash on his temple, and he swayed, dazed. The scarred man laughed, wiping the spit from his face. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But it won't do you any good." He turned to the bearded man. "Tie them both up. We'll take them back to Cedar Falls and collect our money." The bearded man pulled out a length of rope and began binding Slade's hands behind his back. Another outlaw did the same to Wikapi, the rough hemp cutting into her wrists. When they were both secured, the scarred man stepped back and surveyed them with satisfaction. This is going to be a good payday. But as he spoke, Wikapi saw something that made her heart leap. Slade's eyes, though glazed with pain, were focused and alert. And his hands, tied behind his back, were moving. He was working at the knots, his fingers nimble and quick, despite the bindings. She realized that he had allowed himself to be captured, had bought them time by appearing to surrender. Now he was waiting for the right moment to act. She forced herself to look away, to keep her expression defeated and broken so the outlaws would not suspect. The scarred man was talking, boasting about how much money he would make, how he would spend it. The other outlaws were relaxed now, confident in their victory. And that was their mistake. Slade's hands came free, the rope falling away silently. In one fluid motion, he surged to his feet and drove his shoulder into the nearest outlaw, sending the man sprawling. Before anyone could react, Slade had the man's gun in his hand. He fired twice, the shots deafening in the confines of the canyon. The bearded man dropped, clutching his chest. The other outlaw dove for cover, but Slade's third shot caught him in the leg, and he went down screaming. The scarred man spun toward Slade, his gun coming up, but he was too slow. Slade's fourth shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the canyon wall. He slid to the ground, his gun falling from his hand, his face twisted with shock and pain. Slade moved quickly to Wikapi, his knife flashing as he cut through the ropes binding her wrists. She rubbed the raw skin, her hands tingling as blood flow returned. The canyon was filled with the moans of the wounded and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Slade checked each of the outlaws, kicking their weapons away and making sure they posed no further threat. The scarred man was still alive, blood seeping through his fingers as he clutched his shoulder. He looked up at Slade with hatred in his eyes. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Slade stood over him, his expression cold. "Maybe, but I'm not a murderer." "You are." He turned away, leaving the scarred man to bleed in the dirt. They mounted the horse and rode hard for the cabin, the last light of day fading behind them. Wikapi clung to Slade, her body shaking with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. They had survived again, but she knew it could not go on like this. Eventually, their luck would run out. Eventually, they would face an enemy they could not defeat. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. They reached the cabin as full darkness settled over the valley, the horse lathered with sweat and breathing hard from the punishing ride. Slade dismounted first and helped Wikapi down, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at him, seeing the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The blood from his head wound dried in dark streaks along his temple. Without thinking, she reached up and touched the injury gently, her fingers tracing the edges of the gash. He winced but did not pull away. "Inside," she said softly. "Let me clean that." He nodded, and they entered the cabin together, the familiar warmth and smell of wood smoke wrapping around them like a blanket. But the comfort was fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge that they had left 3 wounded men in the canyon. Men who would eventually make their way to civilization and spread word of what had happened. Wickapi heated water over the fire while Slade sat heavily in one of the chairs, his rifle propped against the table within easy reach. She brought the basin to him and began cleaning the wound with careful, gentle movements. The gash was deep, but not as bad as it had first appeared, the bleeding already slowing to a trickle. He sat perfectly still as she worked, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. She found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. There were small scars scattered across his skin, remnants of a life lived hard and without mercy. She wondered about each one, about the stories they told. When she finished bandaging the wound, she did not immediately step away. Instead, she let her hand rest on his shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me again." He opened his eyes and looked up at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "I told you before. I'm not letting anything happen to you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that went beyond mere protection. There was something deeper there, something neither of them had yet put into words. She felt it too, a connection that had formed in the crucible of violence and fear, something that had grown stronger with each passing hour they spent together. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge what was happening between them, but the words would not come. Instead, she simply nodded and stepped back, moving to the fire to prepare food. They ate in silence, both of them too exhausted for conversation. The beans and cornbread were simple fare, but they tasted better than anything Wickapi had eaten in days. When they finished, Slade pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "We can't stay here," he said finally. His voice was heavy with resignation. "They know where we are. Even if those men don't make it out of the canyon, others will come looking." The scarred man had friends, partners. This isn't over. Wickapi felt her stomach tighten with dread. "Where can we go?" Slade was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities. "There's a town called Redemption, about 3 days' ride north. It's rough, but it's got a marshal who actually enforces the law. If we can make it there, we might be able to get protection, maybe even clear your name." She looked at him sharply. "My name, what do you mean?" He met her eyes steadily. "You didn't murder anyone, Wickapi. You defended yourself against men who were trying to harm you. That's not a crime. But the only way to prove that is to get your story in front of someone who'll listen." The idea filled her with both hope and terror. Hope that there might be a way out of this nightmare, a way to stop running and reclaim some semblance of a normal life. Terror at the thought of standing before white men's justice, of trusting a system that had never shown her people anything but cruelty and betrayal. "What if they don't believe me?" she asked. "What if they hang me anyway?" Slade's expression hardened. "Then I'll burn that town to the ground." The ferocity in his voice startled her, and she saw in that moment just how far he was willing to go for her. It should have frightened her, this intensity of feeling from a man she had known for such a short time. Instead, it made her feel safer than she had in years. "We leave at first light," he said, standing and moving to the window to check the darkness beyond. "Pack light. We'll need to move fast." They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Slade gathered ammunition and supplies, double-checking his weapons and filling canteens with fresh water. Wickapi packed food and blankets, her movements automatic as her mind raced ahead to what awaited them. 3 days on the trail meant 3 days exposed, vulnerable to attack from any direction. They would have to avoid the main roads, stick to the high country where fewer people traveled. It would be slow going, but it was their best chance. As she worked, she found herself thinking about what would happen if they actually made it to redemption. Would the marshal listen to her story? Would he care that Dakota had been murdered, that she had been defending herself? Or would he simply see a Lakota woman accused of killing a white man and reach for the rope? Her hand stilled on the blanket she was folding, and she felt a wave of despair wash over her. What was she doing? Why was she allowing herself to hope when hope had proven itself to be such a dangerous thing? Slade noticed her hesitation and crossed to where she stood. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and steady. Whatever happens, you're not facing it alone. She turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. But there was only certainty there, a quiet strength that seemed unshakable. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have sent me away that first night. You could have saved yourself all this trouble." He smiled slightly, a sad, knowing expression. "Maybe I needed the trouble. Maybe I needed something to fight for again." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Wikapi felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained over her emotions. She had been so focused on survival, on simply making it through each day, that she had not allowed herself to feel anything beyond fear and grief. But standing here in the warm light of the cabin, looking into Slade's eyes, she felt something else stirring. Something that felt dangerously like affection, like the beginnings of love. It was too soon, too fast, too complicated. And yet it was there, undeniable and growing stronger with each moment they spent together. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He did not move, did not pull away, just stood there letting her explore the contours of his features. When her hand came to rest against his chest, she could feel his heart beating beneath her palm. Strong and steady, Slade covered her hand with his own, his fingers curling around hers. Wikapi, her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like something sacred. She looked up at him, and the distance between them seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but the space of a single breath. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, to refuse. But she did not refuse. When his lips met hers, it was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were afraid she might break. But then she pressed closer, her free hand sliding up to tangle in his hair, and the kiss deepened. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of two people trying to forget their fear. It was something quieter, more profound. A recognition that they had found in each other something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Slade rested his forehead against hers. "I can't promise you safety. I can't promise you a future. But I can promise you that I'll stand with you until the end, whatever that looks like." She closed her eyes, feeling the sting of tears behind her lids. "That's more than I ever thought I'd have." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, drawing strength from the connection that had formed between them. Then, reluctantly, Slade stepped back. "We should rest. Tomorrow's going to be a hard ride." She nodded, knowing he was right, but wishing they could stay in this moment forever, suspended in a space where the outside world could not touch them. Slade offered her the bed, but she refused, insisting that they both needed rest, and that the bed was big enough for two if they did not mind the closeness. He hesitated, then agreed. They lay down together, fully clothed, with Slade's rifle on the floor beside the bed and his gun within easy reach. Wikapi curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His arm came around her shoulders, holding her close. For the first time since Dakota's death, she felt safe enough to truly rest. Sleep came slowly, creeping over her in waves. She drifted in and out of dreams, fragments of memory and fear mixing with images of a possible future. She saw herself and Slade in a small house somewhere far from here, a place where no one knew their names or cared about their past. She saw children playing in a yard, heard the sound of laughter. But then the dream would shift, darkening into nightmare. She would see Dakota's face, blood spreading across his chest. She would see the outlaw falling in the cabin, his eyes wide with shock. She would see the scarred man reaching for her, his hands closing around her throat. She woke with a gasp, her body rigid with terror. Slade was already awake, his hand on her back, his voice low and soothing. "You're safe. I'm here." She pressed her face against his chest, willing her racing heart to slow. "Just a dream," she whispered. He stroked her hair gently. "I know, but it's over now." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the nightmares would eventually fade. But she knew better. Some things left scars that never fully healed. They stayed awake after that, neither willing to risk sleep again. Slade talked quietly about his plans for the journey, mapping out the route in his mind and sharing it with her. They would head north through the high passes, keeping to the ridgelines where they could see anyone approaching. It would add time to their journey, but it would also keep them away from the main trails where the outlaws might be waiting. As dawn began to break, they rose and finished their preparations. Slade saddled the horse while Wikapi packed the last of their supplies. They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and hard biscuits, washing it down with water from the well. When everything was ready, Slade took one last look around the cabin, his expression unreadable. This was his home, the place he had shared with Catherine, the place where he had buried his grief and tried to find peace. Leaving it felt like abandoning the last piece of his old life. But he turned away without hesitation, helping Wikapi mount the horse before swinging up behind her. They rode out as the sun climbed over the eastern hills, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Wikapi looked back once, seeing the cabin growing smaller in the distance, smoke still curling from the chimney where the fire burned low. Then she turned her face forward, focusing on the trail ahead. The first day of riding was uneventful, the landscape passing in a blur of pine forests and rocky outcroppings. They stopped only briefly to rest the horse and refill their canteens at a small stream. Slade kept a constant watch on their surroundings, his hand never far from his rifle. Wikapi could feel the tension in his body, the coiled readiness of a man expecting trouble at any moment. But the day passed without incident, and as evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered hollow surrounded by thick stands of juniper. Slade built a small fire, keeping it low so the smoke would not give away their position. They ate beans heated in a tin pot, the simple meal filling their stomachs if not satisfying their hunger. As darkness fell, Slade spread their blankets on the ground, and they lay down together. The sky above them scattered with stars. Wikapi pointed out the constellations her grandmother had taught her. Telling Slade the stories that went with each one. He listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the heavens, and she wondered what he was thinking. Did he believe in the spirits her people spoke of, the ancestors who watched from the night sky? Or did he see only distant suns, cold and indifferent to the struggles of those below? When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My mother used to tell me that the stars were the souls of good people, watching over us and keeping us safe. I stopped believing that after she died. But listening to you, I think maybe I'd like to believe it again." She turned her head to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "You're a good man, Slade Bennett. Better than you give yourself credit for." He shook his head slightly. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right. That's all any of us can do." They slept in shifts that night, one keeping watch while the other rested. Wikapi took the first watch, sitting with Slade's rifle across her knees and scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The night was alive with sounds, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the trees. But nothing threatened them, and when it was Slade's turn to watch, she lay down and fell into a dreamless sleep. They rose before dawn and were back on the trail as the first light touched the eastern sky. The second day was harder, the terrain growing more rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, and Wikapi wrapped herself in one of the blankets to ward off the chill. The horse struggled at times, its hooves slipping on loose scree. But Slade guided it carefully, his voice low and encouraging. By midday, they reached a high pass that offered a sweeping view of the country below. Slade reined in the horse, and they sat for a moment, taking in the vast expanse of land stretching out in all directions. Wikapi could see the dark line of the river they had followed, the patchwork of forests and meadows, the distant smudge of mountains on the horizon. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, a reminder of how small they were in the face of such immensity. Slade pointed to a cluster of buildings far to the north, barely visible through the haze. That's redemption. Another day and a half, maybe two if the weather turns. She felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest. What if we don't make it? What if they catch us before we get there? He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. Then we fight. And if we can't win, we make sure they remember us. The words should have been frightening, but instead they were oddly comforting. Whatever happened, they would face it together. They descended from the pass and continued north, the land gradually leveling out into rolling foothills covered in sage and wild grass. As evening approached, they found another place to camp, this time near a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. Slade tended to the horse while Wikapi gathered wood for a fire. They worked in companionable silence, each focused on their tasks. When the fire was burning and the horse was hobbled nearby, they sat down to eat. The food was running low, just a few strips of jerky and some stale bread, but they divided it evenly and ate slowly, savoring each bite. As the stars began to appear overhead, Wikapi felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Despite everything they had been through, despite the danger that still pursued them, she felt more alive than she had in years. It was as if the violence and fear had stripped away everything false, leaving only what was real and true. And what was real was the connection she felt to this man, this quiet, damaged soul who had chosen to stand beside her. Slade broke the silence, his voice thoughtful. What will you do if we make it to redemption? If the marshal believes you and you're free to go, where will you go? She considered the question, turning it over in her mind. I don't know. I can't go back to my village. Not after everything that's happened. And I don't belong in the white man's world. So I don't know where I fit anymore. He nodded slowly, understanding the dilemma. You could stay with me. If you wanted. The offer caught her off guard, and she looked at him in surprise. Stay with you, where? He gestured vaguely toward the north. Redemption, or somewhere near there. Start over. Build something new. It wouldn't be easy, and people would talk. But if you're willing to try, so am I. She felt her throat tighten with emotion. You would do that. Give up your cabin, your land, everything you've built. For me, he met her eyes steadily. I already have. The truth of his words settled over her like a benediction. He had given up everything the moment he opened his door to her, the moment he chose to stand between her and the men who wanted her dead. And he had done it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll even make it to redemption. But if we do, if we survive this, then yes. I'll stay with you. A smile touched his lips, small but genuine. Then we'll make it. We have to. They sat together by the fire, hands clasped, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds around them. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Wikapi allowed herself to hope, The third day dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds. They broke camp quickly and set out, both of them feeling the urgency now. Redemption was close, just a few more hours of riding. But as they descended from the hills into the lower country, Slade suddenly reined in the horse, his body going tense. "What is it?" Wickapi asked. He pointed ahead, and she followed his gaze. In the distance, dust was rising from the trail, a sure sign of riders approaching. "How many?" she whispered. He watched for a moment, his eyes narrowed. "Hard to say. At least 4, maybe more. They're coming fast." Her heart began to race. Could it be them? The Outlaws? Slade's expression was grim. Could be, or it could be someone else. Either way, we need to get off this trail. He turned the horse and urged it into the trees, pushing through the underbrush until they were well concealed. They dismounted and Slade pulled the rifle from its scabbard, checking the chamber. Wickapi drew the small revolver he had given her, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. They waited, the seconds stretching into minutes. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer. And then the riders appeared, 6 men on horseback, moving fast and purposeful. Wickapi's breath caught as she recognized the man in the lead. It was the scarred man, his shoulder bandaged but his face set with determination. He had survived the canyon, had gathered reinforcements, and was coming for them with a vengeance. Slade saw him too, and his jaw tightened. "Stay here, I'll draw them off." Before she could protest, he was moving, slipping through the trees with the rifle in his hands. She wanted to call out, to stop him, but she knew it would only give away their position. So she crouched in the underbrush, her heart pounding, and watched as Slade positioned himself on a small rise overlooking the trail. The riders passed below him, oblivious to his presence. And then Slade fired. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder, and one of the riders pitched forward, falling from his horse. The others scattered, shouting and drawing their weapons. Slade fired again, and another man went down. But then they spotted him, and return fire filled the air, bullets whining through the trees and chipping bark from the trunks around him. Wickapi watched in horror as Slade was forced to retreat, moving back through the trees with the outlaws in pursuit. She could not just hide while he fought alone. She rose from her concealment and ran toward the trail, her revolver raised. One of the outlaws saw her and turned his horse in her direction, his gun coming up. She fired first, the shot going wide, but close enough to make him flinch. He returned fire, and she felt the bullet pass so close to her head that she heard it whistle. She dove behind a fallen log, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The battle raged around her, the air filled with smoke and noise and confusion. She could hear Slade's rifle barking, could hear the shouts of the outlaws as they tried to flank him. She rose and fired again, this time hitting one of the horses. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider. The man hit the ground hard and did not move. 3 down, 3 to go. But the odds were still against them, and Wickapi knew that unless something changed, they were going to die here in these trees, so close to salvation, and yet so far. She heard a shout and turned to see Slade grappling with one of the outlaws, his rifle knocked away, fighting hand to hand. The scarred man was moving toward them, his gun raised, ready to end it. Wickapi did not think. She ran forward, screaming, drawing the scarred man's attention. He turned toward her, his eyes widening in recognition. And then she fired, the bullet taking him in the chest. He staggered, his mouth opening in surprise, and fell. The scarred man hit the ground with a finality that seemed to silence the world, his blood soaking into the earth that had claimed so many before him. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall and 3 of their companions already dead or wounded, broke and ran, their horses thundering away down the trail in a cloud of dust and panic. Wickapi stood frozen, the revolver still smoking in her hand, her ears ringing from the gunfire. She watched them disappear into the distance, unable to fully comprehend that it was over, that they had survived. Slade appeared beside her, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, his chest heaving with exertion. He took the gun gently from her hand and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "It's finally over." They stood there for a long moment, two souls who had walked through fire together and emerged on the other side. Around them, the forest was returning to its normal rhythms, birds beginning to call again, the wind rustling through the leaves. The dead lay where they had fallen, silent witnesses to the violence that had erupted in this peaceful place. Wickapi pulled back slightly and looked up at Slade, seeing the exhaustion and relief written across his features. "We need to go," she said quietly, "before anyone else comes." He nodded, releasing her reluctantly. They gathered their horse, which had bolted during the fight but not gone far, and mounted quickly. Neither of them looked back at the bodies as they rode away, following the trail north toward redemption. The ride to town took the remainder of the day, the landscape gradually changing from wild forest to cultivated fields and grazing pastures. Signs of civilization grew more frequent, fences marking property lines, roads branching off in various directions, the occasional farmhouse sitting in the distance. Wickapi felt her anxiety growing with each mile. They had survived the outlaws, but now they faced a different kind of danger. The judgment of people who might not believe their story, who might see only a Lakota woman accused of murder and a man foolish enough to defend her. Slade seemed to sense her fear, his hand reaching back to squeeze her knee reassuringly. "We'll face it together, whatever comes." His words steadied her, reminding her that she was no longer alone in this fight. The town appeared on the horizon as the sun was setting, its buildings silhouetted against the orange and purple sky. It was larger than Wickapi had expected, with a main street lined with storefronts and houses spreading out in all directions. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear the faint sound of music drifting from one of the saloons. They rode in slowly, drawing curious stares from the people on the street. A Lakota woman and a rough-looking rancher, both spattered with blood and dirt, made quite a sight. Slade guided the horse to the marshal's office, a squat building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. He dismounted and helped Wickapi down, then tied the horse securely. "Ready?" he asked, his hand finding hers. She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his presence. "As I'll ever be." The marshal was a thick-set man in his 50s with gray hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from his desk as they entered, his gaze moving from Slade to Wickapi and back again. "Help you folks?" he asked, his tone neutral. Slade stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Slade Bennett. This is Wickapi. She's been accused of murder, but it's a lie. She was defending herself against men who killed her brother and tried to harm her. We've come to tell you the truth and ask for your protection." The marshal leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "That's quite a story. You got any proof?" Slade nodded. "The bodies of the men who were chasing her are scattered along the trail south of here. They were bounty hunters and outlaws, not lawmen. You check with the trading post at Graybull River, you'll find that her brother was murdered there 3 nights ago. She's the witness, not the criminal." The marshal studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and reached for his hat. "All right, I'll ride out at first light and check your story. In the meantime, you two will stay in town where I can keep an eye on you. There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Henderson runs it. Tell her I sent you." Wickapi felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew this was far from over. But at least they had found someone willing to listen, someone who seemed more interested in truth than expedience. "Thank you, Marshal." He nodded curtly. "Don't thank me yet. If your story doesn't check out, you'll both be facing charges." "Understood." They both nodded, and he gestured toward the door. Go on, get some rest. You look like you need it." Mrs. Henderson was a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. She took one look at them and clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Oh my stars, you two look like you've been through hell itself. Come in, come in." She led them upstairs to a small but clean room with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "There's hot water in the kitchen if you want to wash up, and I'll bring you some supper directly. You just rest now." When she left, closing the door softly behind her, Wikipe and Slade looked at each other and simultaneously began to laugh, a release of tension that had been building for days. They had made it. Against all odds, through violence and fear and impossible choices. They had made it to redemption that night. They ate the best meal Wikipe had tasted in weeks. Thick stew with fresh bread and apple pie for dessert. Mrs. Henderson sat with them for a while, asking gentle questions about where they had come from and what had brought them to redemption. Slade answered carefully, revealing enough to satisfy her curiosity without going into the full bloody details. The older woman seemed to sense there was more to their story, but she did not press. When she left them alone, Wikipe felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her simple kindness without wanting something in return. Slade reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "Things will get better from here." They washed in the hot water Mrs. Henderson provided, scrubbing away the blood and dirt until their skin was pink and clean. Wikipe changed into a simple nightgown the landlady had lent her, the cotton soft and clean against her skin. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen, she found Slade sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt off, carefully cleaning and bandaging the various cuts and scrapes he had accumulated during the fight. She moved to help him, her fingers gentle as they worked. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity now, the awkwardness of early acquaintance burned away by shared danger. When they were both clean and bandaged, they lay down together in the soft bed, wrapped in each other's arms, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. When morning came, the marshal rode out as promised, taking 2 deputies with him. Wikipe and Slade spent the day in town, walking the streets and trying to imagine what a normal life might look like. They visited the general store, where Slade bought her a new dress, simple but well made, in a deep blue that reminded her of twilight. The shopkeeper was polite but reserved, clearly uncertain about serving a Lakota woman. But Slade's steady presence and the coins he placed on the counter smoothed the transaction. They ate lunch at a small restaurant, where the proprietor eyed them suspiciously, but served them without comment. The food was simple but good, and Wikipe savored every bite, amazed at how different the world looked when you were not running for your life. They talked about the future as they walked, about what they would do if the marshal believed their story. Slade spoke of building a cabin, raising horses, creating a life far from the violence they had known. Wikipe listened, letting herself imagine it, a home of her own, a place where she belonged. She thought about the skills her mother had taught her, beadwork and tanning hides, cooking and medicine. Perhaps she could teach others, could find a way to bridge the gap between her people and the white settlers. It was a fragile dream, easily shattered, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it might be possible. 2 days later, the marshal returned. His face was grave as he entered the boarding house where they waited, and Wikipe felt her stomach clench with fear. But then he spoke, and his words brought the relief she had been praying for. "I rode to the trading post," he said without preamble. "Talked to the owner and several witnesses. They confirmed your story about the fight and your brother's death, Miss Wikipe. I also found the bodies on the trail, just where you said they'd be. The scarred man, his name was Cole Dietrich. He was wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder." Wikipe felt her knees go weak with relief, and Slade's arm came around her waist, supporting her. Then I'm free. The marshal nodded slowly. Far as I'm concerned, you acted in self-defense. There won't be any charges. But I'd recommend you stay out of sight for a while. Dietrich had friends, and they might not see things the way the law does. Slade stepped forward, his hand on Wikapi's shoulder. We're planning to settle somewhere nearby. Start fresh. The marshal considered this, then nodded. There's land available east of here, good ranch country. You'd be welcome to file a claim. Government's been encouraging settlement, and a man who knows how to work the land would do well. Slade looked down at Wikapi, his eyes asking the question he did not speak aloud. She smiled up at him, her answer clear in her expression. We'd like that very much. The marshal shook both their hands, his grip firm. Then welcome to redemption. I hope you find what you're looking for here. As he left, Wikapi turned to Slade, her heart so full she thought it might burst. We did it. We actually did it. He pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. We did. Together. They filed their land claim the next day and spent the following weeks building a small cabin on a piece of property that overlooked a river and the mountains beyond. Slade worked with the same quiet determination he brought to everything, while Wikapi helped however she could, learning as she went. The work was hard, the days long, but there was satisfaction in watching their home take shape. Neighbors came by occasionally, some curious, some offering help. The people of Redemption were wary at first, unused to seeing a mixed couple, but Mrs. Henderson vouched for them, and slowly they began to be accepted. Wikapi learned to bake bread and tend a garden, while Slade raised a few head of cattle and horses. It was not an easy life, but it was theirs, built by their own hands and sustained by their commitment to each other. On a cool autumn evening, 6 months after they arrived in Redemption, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. The harvest was in, winter supplies lay by, and for the first time since they had met, there was no immediate danger pressing on them. Wikapi leaned against Slade, his arm around her waist, and thought about how far they had come. From that desperate night when she had knocked on his door, fleeing from death, to this moment of peace and possibility. She thought about Dakota, about her mother, about the life she had left behind. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a way to carry it, to honor those she had lost while still moving forward. You ever regret it? She asked quietly. Opening your door that night. Slade was silent for a moment, then shook his head. Best decision I ever made. Gave me back my life. She turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss that spoke of gratitude and love and hope for all the tomorrows yet to come. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, they went inside together, closing the door on the past and opening themselves to whatever the future might hold. They had survived the storm, had found each other in the chaos, and had built something worth keeping. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A place to call home, someone to stand beside, and the courage to face each new day together. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of winter and the certainty of spring beyond. And in their small cabin by the river, 2 souls who had been lost found their way home at last.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.